There are 86,000 foundations in the United States that we seek funding from through grant proposals. What about in the international context? Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the fundraising school, and I'm joined today by Bryan Roesler. Bryan, through experience in the Peace Corps, has significant expertise in writing grant proposals in that international context, which he now has brought forward as a consultant to help nonprofits do exactly that. We also need to say Bryan is an alum of our master's program at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. So, Bryan, thanks for letting us show off one of our alumni.
Absolutely,
and the great work that you're doing. Tell us a little bit about your experience in the Peace Corps in the context of raising funds by writing grant proposals in an international context.
Absolutely. So my wife and I joined the Peace Corps about 3 years ago. We went over in March of 2017, and we were what are called community development volunteers. And our role was where they placed us, was to work with NGOs to help them work on sustainability. And sustainability is fundraising for those organizations. And for organizations in Eastern Europe, sustainability and fundraising mean grant writing. There's not a strong culture of individual giving like there is here in the United States and somewhat in Western Europe. And so because they lack that culture of individual giving, they rely heavily on writing grants.
So what is that experience like? Are the foundations in those European and other international locations, or were you writing grant proposals back to the United States? What were the sources of the funding?
The sources of the funding were primarily organizations in the United States and within the European Union. In fact, there were almost no foundations within Ukraine that were actually granting money. There were some really innovative NGOs that were starting to build a tradition of small grant making within their communities to individuals for things like neighborhood associations and homeowners associations and small projects. But the large organizations within the country were basically reaching out to the United States Embassy, the Canadian Embassy, the British Embassy, Scandinavian embassies, and other larger international foundations.
So then how did you find foundations where you could apply? You mentioned the embassies just now.
Yeah.
But how would you locate the foundations that would be interested in funding your work, say, in Ukraine?
We had to work in a lot of cases with organizations in other countries as well. And so we would, the organizations that we would work with would have maybe established partnerships with organizations within the European Union, because the international organizations like to do a lot of cross-border grants, and so which requires partnerships with those countries. And so we would work with other organizations in other countries based on what their knowledge and their relationships were with foundations. We'd also just do some good old-fashioned research and work with other and kind of reach out and try to build relationships with foundations. And we also relied pretty heavily within the network of Peace Corps volunteers and working with each other to figure out who's applying to who, what they're applying for, what people are funding, what people are trying to support.
And so Peace Corps volunteers just in the nation where you're working, or Peace Corps volunteers around the world?
Primarily within the nation that we are working, because that's where our network was strongest. But there were an Eastern European Facebook page where volunteers could reach out for and post questions and have resources, and that would be a helpful avenue for some volunteers as well.
Now, when making a request to a donor or writing a grant proposal to a funder, the fundraising school teaches this all starts with making your case. You have to have your case. It needs to be compelling, it needs to be distinct from other nonprofit organizations. How do you make your case in an international context when the potential funder perhaps is not in that nation?
Yeah, so it's all about looking at whatever the funding priorities of that funder is in terms of making the case. And in Ukraine, as you might have heard from the news recently, a lot of that is around anti-corruption efforts right now. And so you get a lot of grants that are supporting anti-corruption efforts for organizations. You have also a lot of grants that are working on building democracy within the country. One of the projects that I worked on was a big effort to decentralize the Ukrainian government. And so that was reducing the power of the central government in Kyiv and providing more local governments with that authority and villages. And so you might have a village community of, 25,000 people, a network of villages, and, one year they had, they got $10,000 USD from the government, and then the next year they got $250,000. And so organizations like mine were working on teaching local governments how to actually run a government efficiently, how to utilize that funds, how to engage local populations in fundraising efforts, or how to use the money, how they want to use the money. And so a lot of the funding went for that kind of priority as well, building democracy within the country. Even though it's a democratic country, there are still lots of things that they need to do to improve their democratic efforts.
So somebody might say that your work is community development, but if you see a funder that says we are interested in power to the people, social justice in terms of grassroots empowerment, decentralizing a national government to provide more authority to local government and local residents, then you're able to say, well, I might call it community development, but it certainly fits within those guidelines with a straight face. You're not chasing the money. The community development work truly does fit into those goals of the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of what we were working on in Ukraine was helping organizations not chase the money. This was a problem that all Peace Corps volunteers faced, was working with them to stay true to their mission and not work on mission drift. It's challenging for them because a lot of the people who run these NGOs, who work in the NGOs in Ukraine and I would imagine in other parts of Eastern Europe, it's oftentimes their second job. So all of the people that I worked with, the majority of them were university professors at the local, one of the local universities. But that funding, the salaries for those type of jobs might be $200 a month, and so these highly talented and trained people go and work at an organization to try to do positive change in their community, but sometimes it requires seeking funds where funds are available.
So the temptation is to chase the money, and guess what? We hear that in the United States all the time.
Oh yeah.
We train about 6,000 people each year at the fundraising school all over the world, and a key message from the fundraising school is don't chase the money. There's certainly plenty of foundations out there. Do your homework, and when your case and your values align with the guidelines of the foundation, then you have a wonderful opportunity to submit a grant proposal. Bryan, let me ask you about the corporate sector. Were you writing proposals to businesses at all, and what did that look like?
No, just primarily to government organizations and private foundations. There were some interesting efforts at social entrepreneurship in Ukraine that were growing, that were engaging businesses and companies in efforts around philanthropy. And so you could kind of see the Ukrainian nonprofit sector kind of working to build relationships with corporate entities. But there was, again, not a strong tradition of corporate fundraising in there. So.
And that's, again, one of the takeaways internationally. There can be opportunities. Say you're doing work in Mexico. Are there United States corporations that do business in Mexico? If you're working in Poland, U.S. corporations that have a strong presence in Poland, their philanthropy might be tied into some of those international locations because they have an office, a factory, a plant, shipping center, and so forth in those international locations. So it's something to keep in mind when you're doing international fundraising. Bryan, kind of last point, what's your big takeaway for fundraisers? What is your big word of advice if they find themselves in an international location and they want to successfully write grant proposals?
Excellent question. So I would provide people to enter it cautiously and carefully, and ensuring that if you're working with an organization internationally, to ensure that you are approaching their funding goals thoughtfully, and ensuring that you're not leading them down a different path, that they're sticking towards their mission, and ensuring that you are also working to build those strong partnerships with other organizations in their community and cross-border partnerships, because that's where a lot of international funders are wanting to see their money go to, is to these wide, large efforts to make foundational changes in countries.
Bryan Roesler has given us good practical advice on writing grant proposals in an international context. But as you can see and hear as Bryan talks, Bryan is a leader who sees the big picture, and that's what happens for our alumni who earn their master's degrees from the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. The title of the degree is Master's in Philanthropic Studies. I'd love to call it Master's Degree in Philanthropic Leadership, and from Bryan's story, you can see why. We ask the big questions, challenge with the big ideas, we ask why and what's next, and that helps prepare you to lead in the philanthropic sector, as we've heard from Bryan and his story today. If you're interested in that master's degree, which by the way, is now available entirely online, you can earn that master's degree in Ukraine, Bryan, if somebody were so to decide, or anywhere else in the world. Information is on our website at philanthropy.iupui.edu. Now, when you throw in the / and the fundraising school, then you find out about our 20 public courses in 18 U.S. cities. You also learn more about our custom training, which we can develop courses specifically for your team, your organization, your nonprofit association, your region. And in fact, on a cost per person basis, the custom training is often the most cost efficient way to go. We also have quarterly webinars and these free weekly podcasts, again on the website at philanthropy.iupui.edu / the fundraising school. With Bryan Roesler, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, and now you are more fully informed on this first day from the fundraising school.